let me tell you something about the cold. Not the kind of cold you know from a frosty morning when your car needs scraping, or the brisk snap of air that sends you reaching for an extra blanket. I mean the kind of cold that breathes, the kind that has a voice, a slow, low voice that speaks through the wind and the ice and the unending gray of a winter sky that forgets to turn blue for months at a time. This is the cold that met the Vikings when they first tried to settle Greenland, and it is the cold that almost swallowed them whole. But before we get to the ice, let us ease into this story the way a ship eases into a sheltered fjord, slow and careful, with plenty of time to look around. It is late or early, depending on how you measure these things. The world outside your window is quiet, or close to it. Maybe there is a street lamp casting its amber glow, or the soft hum of a refrigerator in the next room. Maybe you are lying down, or settled into a comfortable chair with a cup of something warm nearby. That is the right way to hear this. This is not a story for rushing. This is a story for drifting, for letting your thoughts wander across 1,000 years and 1,000 miles of salt-crusted sea, until you find yourself standing on a shore that has never known a plow or a village or a hearth fire. Imagine, if you will, a day in the late 10th century, around the year 985 or so. The exact date is a little hazy because the sagas were written down later, and memory is a foggy thing even when it is scratched into parchment with a quill. But what we know is this. A man named Eric the Red had been exiled from Iceland for some trouble involving a few neighborly disputes, and, as the stories say, a few killings. The details are murky, and honestly, the way sleepy history works is that we do not need to dwell on the violence. Let us just say that Eric had a talent for making enemies and a vision for making a new start. He had heard rumors of a land to the west, a place of green valleys and rich pastures, where a man could build a life without looking over his shoulder. He sailed there, spent a few years exploring, and then returned to Iceland with a name that was pure marketing genius. He called it Greenland. There is a gentle humor in that name, if you think about it. Greenland, a name chosen not for what the land was, but for what Eric needed it to be. He needed people to follow him. He needed settlers to fill the holds of his ships, to bring their families and their cattle and their dreams of a fertile new home. And so he painted a picture of a land that was green and welcoming, a land where the winters were mild and the grass grew tall. Was it a lie? Not entirely. The coastal fjords of southern Greenland are indeed green in the summer, carpeted with wildflowers and dotted with birch thickets. But the name, like all good marketing, glossed over the small print. The small print being that Greenland is mostly ice. An enormous ice cap, miles deep, covers the interior. The green is just a fringe, a thin ribbon of livable land along the coast, and even that ribbon is a fragile thing, pinned between the sea and the slow, grinding weight of a frozen continent. But the settlers came. They filled about 25 ships, we are told, and set sail from Iceland in the summer of Ninniitviv. The journey was brutal. Storms scattered the fleet. Some ships turned back, Some were lost entirely, swallowed by the North Atlantic without a trace. Only 14 ships made it to the promised land. Imagine that. 14 ships, carrying perhaps 400 or 500 people, plus their livestock, their tools, their seeds, their household goods, their hopes. They arrived in a country that had no docks, no roads, no shelters, no supplies. Just the green of the valleys, the blue of the fjords, and the distant, gleaming white of the ice cap. And the knowledge that winter was coming. Winter always comes to Greenland. It is not a question of if, but of when, and of how hard. And that is where our story truly begins. Not with the voyage, not with the landing, but with the first winter. The first time these people, these farmers and fishermen from Iceland and Norway, who thought they knew what cold meant, found out what cold really means. Let us set the scene. The settlement was called Brattahlid, which means steep slope, and it was Eric the Red's own farm, nestled at the head of a deep fjord in what is now called the Eastern Settlement. The name is misleading again. The Eastern Settlement was not in the east of Greenland, but on the southern tip of the island, because the Norse measured direction from their own perspective. It is a small detail, but I like it. It reminds us that these were people navigating by their own internal compass, making sense of a new world with the tools of the old. The first winter came quickly, as it always does at those high latitudes. The sun, which had lingered in the sky all summer, began to sink lower and lower, until the days became a short, dim light, and the nights stretched on for what felt like forever. The temperature dropped. The ground froze. The grass, which had been so green and promising, withered and turned brown. The livestock, those precious cows and sheep and goats that the settlers had brought across the sea, huddled together in the byres, and the settlers huddled in their houses, and the wind, that endless Greenland wind, moaned and rattled at the walls. And this is where a sleepy history story must pause and appreciate the simple, profound details of survival. The settlers built their houses from stone and turf, not the grand log cabins of later American frontiers, because there were no trees. Greenland had only a few dwarf birches and willows, thin and twisted, barely good for kindling. So they cut blocks of turf, thick with roots and soil, and stacked them to make walls. They roofed the houses with driftwood, carefully collected from the beaches, and layers of turf on top of that. The houses were long and narrow, built around a central hearth, with benches along the walls for sleeping and working. There were no windows, or very few, just a hole in the roof to let out the smoke. Inside, it was warm, or warm enough. The heat from the fire, the bodies of the people, the animals in the byre that was often attached to the house, all of it combined to create a bubble of livable warmth in a frozen world. But the warmth came at a cost. The smoke. The hearth fire burned constantly through the long winter, and it filled the house with a thick, acrid haze. The settlers' lungs were black with it. Their eyes were red and stinging. Their clothes, their bedding, their skin, everything smelled of smoke. It was a smell they lived in, slept in, breathed in, from October to April. And yet, it was the price of life. The fire was not just for warmth. It was for light, for cooking, for melting snow, for drinking water, for boiling the tough, salted meat that was their main food during the long dark. And what did they eat? This is a crucial part of the story. The settlers had brought cattle, but the cattle needed hay, and hay required summer grazing and hard work. The first winter, the grass had not yet been fully established. The hay stores were meager. The cattle were precious, not for their meat, but for their milk and their wool. So you did not slaughter a cow lightly. Instead, you fed it as best you could, and you milked it through the winter, and you made butter and cheese, and you stretched every drop and every crumb. But the milk ran low in the dead of winter, when the cows were thin and the hay was nearly gone. The settlers had also brought sheep and goats, and they were hardier, but still, the winter was a time of scarcity. The deep cold kept them from hunting for weeks on end, so they prepared for winter like no other people on earth. The summer was a frenzy of work. They cut hay with scythes, gathering every blade they could find in the meadows. They fished for Arctic char and cod, drying the catch on wooden racks in the sun and wind. They hunted seals, which were not just food, but also a source of oil for lamps and leather for ropes and clothing. They hunted walrus and even polar bear, though that was rare and dangerous. They gathered berries and herbs. They collected driftwood and seal bones for fuel. Every resource was counted. Every scrap of food was stored. And when the winter came, they lived on what they had gathered. It was a life of constant calculation, a balancing act between the generosity of the summer and the greed of the winter. But let us stay with that first winter for a moment, because it is the one that matters most. The sagas are quiet on the specifics. They do not say if anyone starved, though it is likely that some did. They do not say if the cold took any of the old ones or the young ones. The sagas are more interested in feuds and explorations and the grand sweep of events. But the quiet truth of the first winter is that it was a test of everything they knew, everything they had brought, everything they were. The test was simple. Can you last until the sun comes back? And the sun does come back. That is the other thing about the Greenland winter. It is long, but it is not eternal. In January, the days begin to lengthen. At first, the change is almost imperceptible. A few more minutes of light each day. But then the sun starts to climb higher, and the light grows stronger, and the edge of the ice begins to soften, and there is a feeling in the air, a sense of the world waking up. For the settlers, this was the turning point. The time when the seals started to haul out on the ice again, when the birds returned, when the hay stores could be stretched a little further. They had made it. The first winter was over. And when it was over, they did not celebrate. They did not have the energy or the resources for celebration. They simply began to prepare for the next one, because that is the secret of the Viking settlers in Greenland. They did not conquer the cold. They learned to live with it. They learned to use it. They learned to read its moods and its seasons, to know when to push and when to pull back. They built their houses to shed the snow. They oriented their farms to catch the southern sun. They developed a breed of sheep that could survive on the sparse winter grazing. They made clothing from seal skin and wool that was windproof and warm. They became, over generations, a people of the ice and the rock and the sea, and they survived for nearly 500 years, 500 winters. Think about that, a half a millennium. They built churches and farms and trade routes. They sent ships back to Iceland and Norway, and even to North America. They lived and died, loved and quarreled, raised children, and told stories, all in that narrow green fringe between the sea and the eternal ice. They were not the first people to live in Greenland. The Inuit had been there for centuries before them, and the Norse learned from them, trading and intermarrying, though the sagas rarely mention it. The survival of the Norse in Greenland was not a story of heroic individualism. It was a story of adaptation, of learning, of slow and patient work. It was a story of building a life in a place that did not want you to live. And now you are starting to drift, I can tell. The fire is burning low, the tea is cold, and your eyelids are heavy. That is fine. This is the right state of mind for this story. Because the story of the Viking settlers in Greenland is not a story of action and adventure, though there is plenty of both. It is a story of waiting, of enduring, of the slow, quiet work of staying alive when everything around you is trying to turn you to ice. It is a story that fits the long, dark hours of the night, when the wind is blowing outside and you are safe and warm inside, and you can let your mind wander to a time when warmth was not a given, when winter was not just a season, but a test of everything you were. So let us rest here, in the moment after the first winter ended. The snow is still deep, but the light is returning. The seals are coming back to the ice. The hay stores are low, but the milk is flowing again. The settlers are thin and tired, but they are alive. They have passed the first test. They do not know it, but harder winters are still to come. Winters of crop failure and starvation and abandonment. Winters that would test their faith and their patience and their will to stay. But all of that is far away. For now, there is just the slow return of the light, the smell of the sea, and the quiet, stubborn pulse of life in the longhouses. I want you to picture the scene one more time before we move on. It is early spring. The fjord is still choked with ice, but there are cracks in it now, dark lines of open water. The air is cold, but there is a softness to it, a dampness that was not there in the deep winter. A man named Eric, or maybe his son Leif, stands on the slope above the farm. He is wrapped in a cloak of wool, and his breath makes clouds in the air. He is looking out at the fjord, at the ice, at the distant mountains, still white with snow. He is thinking about the summer ahead, the hay to be cut, the fish to be caught, the house to be repaired. He is thinking about next winter and the winter after that. He does not know that he is making history. He is just a man living his life in a place that is beautiful and terrible and full of quiet lessons. And he is ready for whatever comes next. Let the story rest there for now, like a ship at anchor in a calm harbor. We will set sail again soon, deeper into the long centuries of Norse Greenland. But for tonight, let the image hold. A man on a green slope, the ice shining in the growing light, and the promise of another summer, another winter, another chance. It is a patient story. It will wait for you. And so the man on the slope, Eric or Leif, or perhaps some other settler whose name has been lost to the sagas, turns his gaze away from the fjord and back toward the farm. He has 3 cows in the byre, thin but alive. He has a few dozen sheep scattered across the hillsides, picking at the tender shoots of grass that have just begun to push through the melting snow. He has a wife inside the longhouse, tending the fire, and children who are growing faster than the hay. And he has a feeling in his chest that he cannot quite name. It is not hope, exactly. Hope is too bright a word for these people. It is more like a slow, stubborn patience, a knowledge that the winter is over, but that another will come, and that the work of living must continue. The first winter had been a trial by ice, but the second winter would be a trial by learning. Because the settlers had discovered something that no saga could have told them. Greenland is not Iceland. The fjords are deeper, the ice is thicker, the summers are shorter. The grass that grows in the meadows is not as rich as the grass they left behind. The cattle are not as strong. The sheep are hardier, but even they struggle when the snow covers the ground for months on end. So the settlers had to change. They had to think differently about their land, their animals, their own bodies. In the second summer, when the ice broke and the ships from Iceland brought a few more families and some fresh supplies, the settlers began to experiment. They learned to cut hay earlier, before the grass went to seed, because the early hay had more nutrition. They learned to spread the hay out in thin layers on long racks, turning it every day so that it dried quickly in the cool, damp air. They learned to store it in barns built with thick stone walls and turf roofs, roofs that leaked only a little and kept the hay from rotting. They learned to measure the hay by weight, not by volume, because a loose pile of stalks might look abundant, but could be as worthless as air. And they learned about the animals. The cattle were the most vulnerable. They needed warm shelter, and they needed a lot of food. So the settlers built the byres inside the longhouse, sharing their own body heat with the beasts. The cows were stabled at one end of the room, the family at the other, with a low wall of stone or wood between them. The breath of the cattle helped warm the air, and the warmth of the family helped keep the cattle from freezing. It was a strange way to live, sleeping next to the soft, heavy breathing of cows, but it was the difference between life and death. The smell was strong, but after a while, you stopped noticing. What you noticed was the warmth, and the sound of the animals stirring in the dark, and the knowledge that they were alive because you were alive. The sheep and goats were rougher. They could tolerate the cold better, but they still needed shelter during the worst storms. The settlers built stone sheepfolds, low walls that blocked the wind, and they led the animals inside when the weather turned savage. They also learned to cull the weakest animals before winter, to save the hay for the strongest breeders. It was a harsh decision to butcher a lamb that had the same trust as a dog, but it was necessary. You did not have the luxury of sentiment in a land where a single bad winter could wipe out half your stock. And then there were the goats. Goats are wonderful creatures for a marginal farm. They eat almost anything: grass, twigs, seaweed, even the bark of trees. They produce milk that is rich and creamy, and they can breed twice a year. The Norse settlers in Greenland kept goats, and the goats thrived. They were not as glamorous as the cattle, but they were reliable. In the worst winters, when the cows stopped giving milk and the sheep grew thin and listless, the goats kept producing. They were the backup plan, the safety net, the quiet heroes of the longhouse. But even with goats and sheep and cows, the settlers could not live on milk alone. They needed meat, and they needed fat. The meat came from the sea and the ice. The first winter taught them that the seal was their greatest friend. The ringed seal, which stayed in the fjords year-round, could be hunted even in the deepest cold, as long as you knew where to find its breathing holes in the ice. The harp seal, which migrated along the coast, came in huge numbers in the spring. The walrus, which gathered on remote islands, provided meat and ivory and thick, tough hide. And the polar bear, though rare and dangerous, was a prize beyond measure. A single polar bear could feed a family for weeks, and its fur was the warmest in the world. But hunting was dangerous. The ice could crack beneath your feet. The wind could blind you with snow. The polar bear could turn on you, and you would be dead before you could shout for help. The settlers learned to hunt in groups, to share the risk, to mark the safe paths across the ice. They learned to make harpoons and spears from bone and driftwood, and they learned to sew waterproof clothing from seal gut. They learned to read the behavior of the seals, to know when they would surface, to strike with speed and precision. And they learned to be patient. Patience was the greatest virtue in the hunt. You could wait for hours at a breathing hole, your fingers numb, your breath frozen in your beard. And then, in a single moment of action, you would catch your meal. It was a skill that took years to master, and some never mastered it. The fish were easier. The Arctic char ran up the rivers in summer, thick and fat from feeding in the sea. The settlers built stone weirs to trap them, and they caught them by the hundreds. They also fished for cod from boats, using lines made of horsehair or sinew. They dried the fish on racks, and the dried fish kept for years. It was not as tasty as fresh fish, but it was filling. And when you had no fresh meat, no milk, no butter, a piece of dried fish soaked in water could keep you alive for another day. But the settlers also hunted birds. The cliffs along the coast were full of seabirds, guillemots, puffins, and auks. In the spring, the birds laid eggs, and the settlers climbed the cliffs to gather them. It was a terrifying task. The cliffs were steep, the rocks were loose, and a fall would mean certain death. But the eggs were worth the risk. They were rich and nutritious, and they could be stored for months in a cool place. The settlers also netted birds in flight, using long poles with nets attached. It was a skill you learned from the Inuit, who were already masters of the bird hunt. And though the sagas rarely mention it, the Norse did learn from the Inuit. They learned to build igloos for temporary shelters, to use dog sleds for travel, to make better harpoons and more waterproof clothing. The two peoples traded and taught each other, though they never fully trusted each other. It was a relationship of necessity, not friendship. And so the second winter came, and the third, and the 10th. The settlers learned to stack their hay in the barns, to repair their walls before the frost could crack the stone, to store their butter in the permafrost so that it stayed fresh through the summer. They learned to make cheese and to render seal fat into oil for their lamps. They learned to brew a kind of beer from the little barley they could grow, though it was weak and sour. They learned to make bread from ground rock lichen, because the barley never grew well, and because the rye that they planted in the few sunny patches often failed. They learned to use every part of every animal, the bones for tools, the sinews for thread, the hides for shoes and bags, the bladders for storage, the stomachs for making a kind of sour butter that could be kept for years. And they learned to tell stories. In the long winter evenings, when the wind howled outside and the snow piled up against the door, they would gather around the fire and recite the sagas. They would tell of Eric the Red, who discovered Greenland, and of Leif the Lucky, who found Finland. They would tell of the great feuds in Iceland, of ghosts and gods and heroes. They would tell stories that had been passed down from their grandparents, who had lived in Norway before the long migration westward. And in the telling, they remembered who they were. The stories were a thread that connected them to a world beyond the ice, a world of green fields and warm summers, of kings and battles, and the sea that stretched to the horizon. The stories were a kind of food, as nourishing as dried fish or seal blubber. But the stories could not protect them from the occasional catastrophe. There were winters when the hay crop failed, when the seals did not come, when the fish disappeared into the deep currents. Those were the winters of hunger, when the settlers killed their spare animals, then their breeding stock, then the old and the sick animals. And if that was not enough, they ate the dogs, and then they ate the hides from the walls, boiled into a thin, gelatinous soup. Those winters were the hardest, and some families did not survive them. The skeletons of those failed farms are still scattered across the Greenland landscape, the stones of the longhouses tumbled and overgrown, a silent testimony to the limits of endurance. But the majority of farms did survive, and they grew. By the time a generation had passed, the settlements along the Western Settlement and the Eastern Settlement were thriving. The Western Settlement was the more remote, farther north, closer to the ice. The farms there were smaller, the hayfields poorer, but the hunting was better, and the sea was rich. The people of the Western Settlement became expert hunters, trading furs and walrus ivory to the Eastern Settlement for grain and iron. The Eastern Settlement was the heart of Norse Greenland. It had the best farmland, the largest churches, the main harbor for ships from Iceland and Norway. The bishops of Greenland lived there, in a tiny stone cathedral that could hold only a few dozen people. And the merchants came from Norway and from the distant shores of Europe to trade for the white tusks of the walrus, which were worth their weight in silver. And so the settlers did not just survive. They built a society. They built churches and farms and trade routes. They built a system of laws and courts, with a parliament that met once a year on a flat rock near the fjord. They built a way of life that was adapted to the rhythms of the cold. They grew children who knew how to read the sky and the snow. They grew old men who had seen 40 winters, who could tell you when the ice would break and when the seals would return. They grew wise women who knew which herbs could heal a fever and which could ease a difficult birth. They grew poets who could recite the sagas for days on end without repeating a single line. And yet, even as they built, they knew that they were living on the edge of the world. The sea ice could trap their ships for years at a time. The cold could kill the barley before it even sprouted. The Greenlandic ice sheet could advance or retreat, and when it advanced, it swallowed the grazing lands and the seal hunting grounds. The climate of Greenland was not stable. It warmed and cooled in cycles that the settlers could not understand. They only knew that some decades were good and some were bad, and that when the bad decades stretched into bad centuries, the settlements began to shrink. But that is a story for later, for when the winter night is deeper and the fire is burning lower. For now, let us stay with the settlers in the early years, when the future still seemed possible. Let us stay with the man on the slope, who is no longer looking at the fjord, but is now walking back toward the longhouse. He is thinking about his cows and about the hay he will cut in the summer. He is thinking about his children, who are learning to read the landscape, learning to see where the grass grows thick and where the seals haul out. He is thinking about the ship that should come from Iceland this summer, bringing news and supplies, and perhaps a new family or two. He is thinking about the church, which is only a half-built pile of stones, but which will be finished one day, and which will stand for centuries after he is gone. And he is thinking about the quiet miracle of a spring morning in Greenland. The sky is a pale blue, almost white, and the sun is warm on his face. The snow is melting, and the ground beneath his feet is soft and wet. He can hear the sound of water running, the first trickles of meltwater making their way down the slopes. He can smell the earth, the faint, good smell of soil waking up. And he feels something that he has not felt in months. He feels a little bit of ease, not happiness, not joy, but a loosening of the knot in his chest that has been there since the first snow fell. The winter is over. The summer is coming. And for now, for this one small moment, there is enough. He reaches the door of the longhouse, pushes aside the heavy hide that hangs across the entrance, and steps inside. The air is warm and smoky from the fire. The cows are munching their hay in the byre. His wife is kneading dough, a mixture of barley and ground lichen, for a flatbread that will be tough and bland, but will fill the stomach. His children are playing on the floor with a set of sheep bones, clicking them together in a pattern only they understand. He nods to his wife, takes a seat on a bench near the fire, and begins to mend a harness made of seal leather. The work is slow, quiet, repetitive. The fire crackles, the cows breathe, the children laugh, and the man feels in his bones that this is what survival looks like. Not heroic, not glorious, just a family in a house on the edge of the ice, doing the small, careful work of staying alive. And as you listen to the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the animals, you might feel your own body settling deeper into the chair or the bed. That is the right feeling, because the story of the Viking settlers in Greenland is not a story to be admired from a distance. It is a story to be felt, to be remembered in the quiet hours when the world outside is cold and dark, and you have nothing to do but breathe and listen and let your mind wander. The settlers knew that peace too. They knew the peace of a long winter evening when all the work was done for the day, when the fire was burning, and when the only sound was the wind outside and the heartbeat of the family inside. It is a peace that does not need words. It is a peace that simply is. So let the image of that longhouse hold you for a while. The walls are thick and dark, built of stone and turf. The fire is in the center of the room, and the smoke rises to a hole in the roof. The light is orange and flickering. The shadows dance on the walls. The people are quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, but together in the warmth. And outside, the ice stretches away to the horizon, and the stars are hard and bright, and the world is silent and vast. But inside, there is life. There is breath. There is the endless, patient work of staying alive. And that is enough. That is always enough. And perhaps you are wondering about the children. What was it like to grow up in a house like that, where the walls smelled of earth and smoke, where the sound of the wind was as constant as your own heartbeat, where the world outside was a world of ice and rock, and a sea that could kill you in a matter of minutes if you made a mistake? The children of the Greenland settlers did not have a childhood as we might understand it. They had a childhood of work and learning, of watching and imitating, of being given small tasks that grew larger as they grew older. A child of 5 or 6 could be trusted to watch the cows while they grazed on the summer pastures, to chase away the foxes and the ravens that might steal a newborn lamb, to bring water from the stream in a leather bucket that was almost as big as the child herself. A child of 8 or 9 could help with the haymaking, using a small rake or just her hands to gather the grass into piles, learning to judge the weather by the shape of the clouds and the direction of the wind. By the time a child was 12 or 13, she could be left in charge of the farm for a whole day, milking the cows, feeding the pigs, mending the fence, tending the fire. And by the time a child was 15, he or she was considered an adult, ready to marry and start a household of their own. But it was not all work. There were moments of play, of course. There were games with sheep bones and pebbles, songs and riddles told around the fire, contests of strength and speed on the short summer evenings. The children would race across the hayfields, their bare feet slapping against the damp earth, their laughter carrying across the fjord like a bird. They would climb the cliffs to find the nests of seabirds, stealing eggs that their mothers would cook in butter. They would swim in the cold water of the fjord, gasping and shrieking, their skin turning pink and then blue. They would explore the ruins of the old stone houses that the earlier inhabitants, the people the Norse called the Skrælingr, had left behind. Those ruins were mysterious and a little frightening. full of strange tools and bones, and the children would whisper stories about the spirits that might still live there, watching from the shadows. And there was learning, too, not the kind of learning that comes from books, because there were no books in Greenland except for the few that the priests had brought, and those were written in Latin and were not for children. The learning was the kind that comes from the land itself. A child learned to read the tracks of the fox and the hare, to know where the ptarmigan hid in the snow, to tell the difference between the edible lichens and the poisonous ones. A child learned to weave, to carve, to sew the skins of seals into boots and hats and mittens. A child learned to navigate by the stars, to find north by the position of the pole star, to predict the coming of a storm by the color of the sky at sunset. And above all, a child learned the stories of the ancestors, of the gods and the heroes, of the first settlers who had crossed the sea from Iceland. The stories were a kind of inheritance, a treasure that could not be lost or stolen, a map of meaning in a world that was often hard and confusing. There was one story that every child in Greenland knew by heart. It was the story of Eric the Red, the founder of the colony, the man who had named this frozen land Greenland in a stroke of marketing genius that still made the settlers smile, even after all these years. Eric had been an outlaw in Iceland, a troublemaker who had killed a man in a quarrel, and he had been banished for 3 years. During those 3 years, he had sailed west and discovered this new land, with its deep fjords and green valleys. He had returned to Iceland and told everyone that he had found a green and fertile land, a land of promise, a land that was just waiting for brave men and women to claim it. And they had believed him, or at least they had been desperate enough to take the chance. And so the ships had sailed and the settlers had come, and here they were, living in the land that Eric had promised, sometimes green and sometimes white, but always their home. The children would ask again and again what Eric had been like. Was he tall? Was he strong? Did he have a beard down to his belt? And the old men would tell them, yes, he was tall and strong, and his beard was red like a flame. And he was fierce and clever and sometimes cruel. But he was the kind of man who could build a world out of nothing but ice and stone and will. And the children would listen, and they would dream, and they would grow up wanting to be like Eric, brave enough to sail into the unknown, strong enough to survive the winter, clever enough to make a home in a place where no one had lived before. But the children also knew that Eric was not the only hero of the settlement. There were women, too, who were just as brave and just as strong. There was T.H. Jodhild, Eric's wife, who had refused to give up her Christian faith even when her husband threatened to leave her. She had built the first church in Greenland, a tiny wooden chapel on a hill above the fjord, and she had prayed every day for the souls of her family and her neighbors. There was Gudrid, the daughter of a chieftain, who had sailed from Iceland with her husband and had become the most famous traveler of her age, going all the way to Vinland and beyond, meeting the native peoples and learning their ways. There was Freydis, Eric's daughter, who was as fierce as her father, who had taken up a sword and driven back a party of attackers with nothing but her courage and her fury. The children knew all these stories, and they knew that they came from a long line of survivors, a line that stretched back to the first men and women who had dared to cross the sea. And as the years passed, the children grew, and the settlement grew, and the stories grew with them. New stories were added, stories of the settlers' own time, of the winters that were so cold that the milk froze in the bucket before it could be brought inside, of the summers that were so warm that the hay grew thick and tall, of the traders who arrived from Norway with iron tools and cloth and wine, of the raids by the Skralinger, which were rare but always terrifying, of the bishops who came to bless the churches, and the priests who taught the children to read and write. Each generation added its own chapter to the saga of Greenland, and the saga was never finished. But the most important story of all was the story of the spring. Every year, when the sun finally seemed to stay in the sky a little longer, when the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared, the settlers would gather on the slope above the fjord and watch the ice break up. It was a slow process at first. The ice would crack, and the cracks would widen, and the water would appear dark and cold between the white sheets. Then the ice would begin to move, drifting out of the fjord into the open sea, and the sound of it, the grinding and the creaking, could be heard for miles. It was a sound like no other, a sound that meant the end of the long imprisonment, the beginning of the short freedom. The settlers would watch for hours, their faces turned to the sun, their eyes squinting against the glare. And they would feel the hope rising in their chests, the same hope that had brought their ancestors across the sea, the same hope that had kept them alive through all the dark months. And then, one day, the fjord would be clear. The water would be blue and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The birds would return, the gulls and the terns and the eiders, filling the air with their calls. The seals would haul out on the rocks, sunning themselves, their heads lifted to the warmth. And the settlers would launch their boats, the small skin boats that they called curraghs, and they would row out to fish for cod and capelin, to set their nets and lay their lines. The sea would be rich, and the fish would be abundant, and for a few weeks there would be plenty. The children would eat fresh fish, roasted on a stick over the fire, the fat dripping down their chins. The women would dry the surplus, hanging the fish on racks in the sun, preserving them for the winter to come. The men would hunt the seals, and the sealskin would be turned into ropes and boots and watertight containers. And the cattle would be let out of the byre, blinking in the sunlight, and they would walk stiff-legged down to the meadows, where the grass was already growing tall. And in the middle of all that activity, there would be a pause, a moment of stillness, when the work was done for the day and the sun was low in the sky, and the whole settlement seemed to breathe. The children would be tired, and the adults would be tired, and there would be nothing left to do but sit on the turf roofs of the houses and watch the sun go down. The colors would be soft, pink and gold and lavender, spreading across the sky like a promise. The fjord would be still, the mountains would be dark, and the air would be filled with the smell of the sea and the grass and the smoke from the fires. And the settlers would feel, for a moment, that they were not just surviving, but living. That they had made a life in this place, a life that was hard and beautiful and full of meaning. And so the children learned not only how to work, but how to wait, how to endure the long, dark winter without losing hope, how to watch the slow return of the light without growing impatient, how to find pleasure in the small things, the taste of a piece of seal meat, the warmth of a fire, the sound of a mother's voice singing a lullaby. They learned that survival was not just about having enough food and enough shelter. It was about having enough patience, enough imagination, enough faith that the spring would come again. And somehow, year after year, it did. The ice always broke, the grass always grew, the fish always returned, and the children grew up and had children of their own, and the story continued. Now, if you close your eyes and imagine yourself on that slope, sitting on a flat stone, watching the fjord shimmer in the evening light, you might feel the same thing they felt, a sense of peace that comes from knowing that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to do. The world is wide and cold and full of dangers, but here, in this small moment, there is nothing to fear. There's only the sound of the water and the cry of the gulls and the warmth of the sun on your face. And you can let go of all the worries that you have carried with you, the things that you need to do tomorrow, and the things that you should have done yesterday. You can let them drift away like the ice floes out of the fjord into the open sea, where they melt and become nothing. Because the story of the Viking settlers is not just a story about the past. It is a story that lives in the present, in the quiet moments when you allow yourself to slow down and listen. The same cold that they felt can be felt in the chill of a winter evening. The same warmth that they shared around the fire can be found in the comfort of your own home. The same hope that kept them alive is the hope that keeps you going day after day, even when the path is uncertain. They were not so different from you. They loved their children. They worried about the future. They laughed at silly jokes. They cried when someone died. They were human in all the messy, beautiful, fragile ways that humans have always been. And that is why their story matters. Not because they were heroes, but because they were ordinary. They did not have any special magic or secret knowledge. They had only their hands, their minds, their traditions, and each other. And that was enough to build a new world in the most unlikely place on earth. It was enough to survive the first winter, and the second, and the 100th. It was enough to leave a mark on the land, a mark that we can still see today in the ruins of their farms and the traces of their fields. And it is enough to inspire us here in our own lives as we face our own winters, our own ice, our own long nights. So let the story settle into you like the warmth of the fire settling into your bones. Let yourself drift like the smoke rising through the hole in the roof. And when you are ready, you will know that the story is not over. The night is still long. There are more winters to tell about, more summers to imagine, more voices to hear in the crackle of the flames. But for now, there is only this: the longhouse, the family, the quiet miracle of being alive on a spring morning in Greenland. And that, as the settlers knew, is always enough. And that, as the settlers knew, is always enough. But the story of Greenland did not stay simple. The first winter had been a trial of fire and ice, but the second winter was something else. It was the winter when the settlers began to understand that survival was not a single victory, but a long, slow conversation with the land. The land spoke in many voices, some kind, some stern, and the settlers had to learn to listen. They had to learn that the sea would not always give them fish, that the sun would not always return on the same day, that the cattle would not always thrive. And they had to learn that the most important thing was not to outsmart the land, but to live with it, to accept its moods and its rhythms, and to find a way to fit their own rhythms into the larger song. It was during the second winter that the settlers discovered the secret of the winter light. Not the sunlight, but the moonlight. In the deep winter, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, the moon became their companion. It hung in the sky for days at a time, sometimes full and bright, sometimes thin and silver, but always present. And the settlers, who had grown up in lands where the sun was a constant presence, learned to love the moon. They learned to hunt by its light, to travel by its light, to tell stories by its light. They learned that the moon was not a poor substitute for the sun, but a different kind of light, softer and more patient, a light that did not blind or burn, but simply showed the way. And the children, of course, were the first to notice the magic of the moon. They would lie on the frozen ground, wrapped in furs, watching the moon drift across the sky, and they would imagine that they could see faces in its pale surface. They would tell each other stories about the man in the moon, the woman in the moon, the fox that stole the moon and hid it in a cave. And their parents, who had heard these same stories as children in Iceland, would smile and remember that the world was still full of wonder, even in the darkness. But the winter was long, and the food stores began to run low. The dried fish and seal meat that had seemed so abundant in the autumn now seemed scarce. The cattle had been slaughtered one by one, and the salted meat was precious. The settlers had to ration their food carefully, measuring out portions, stretching the supplies as far as they could. And it was in this scarcity that they discovered another secret, one that was both practical and strange. They discovered that hunger, when it is shared, becomes less sharp, that a meal eaten in company tastes better than a feast eaten alone, that the simple act of passing a bowl of broth from hand to hand around the fire could feel like a ceremony, a small ritual of connection that warmed the heart as much as the broth warmed the belly. And so, the long winter became a time of storytelling, not just the old stories, but new ones, stories that the settlers made up to pass the hours. They told stories of the trolls that lived in the mountains, the giants that slept beneath the glaciers, the sea monsters that lurked in the deep fjords. They told stories of the heroes of old, of Eric the Red and his voyages, of the gods who lived in Asgard and watched over the world. And they told stories of themselves, of their own lives, of the small adventures and misadventures that had brought them to this place. They told the story of the man who had lost his axe in the river and spent a whole day looking for it, only to find it in his own pocket. They told the story of the woman who had tried to milk a seal and gotten bitten for her trouble. And they laughed, and the laughter echoed off the turf walls and mingled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. And it was in the middle of one of these long winter nights, when the fire was low and the children were drowsy, that the oldest settler, a woman named Gudrid, told a story that no one had heard before. She told of a dream she had had, a dream in which she had walked across the ice to a land that was green and warm, a land where the grass grew tall and the trees bore fruit, a land where the sun never set and the rivers ran with milk. And in the dream, she had met a people who were not like any she had ever known. They were tall and dark-haired, and they spoke a language that she could not understand, but they smiled at her and offered her food and drink, and she felt a deep peace, a peace that she had not felt since she left Iceland. And when she woke, she had the feeling that the dream was not just a dream, that it was a message, a promise, a glimpse of a place that existed somewhere beyond the ice. The other settlers listened in silence. They did not laugh. They did not dismiss the dream as a fancy. They knew that dreams were important, that the gods often spoke through dreams, that the world of the spirit was as real as the world of the flesh. And so they began to wonder, was there such a land? Could it be reached? And if it could, what would they find there? These questions stayed with them, lurking in the back of their minds, even as the winter wore on and the days grew longer and the ice began to thaw. And when the spring came and the fjord was clear, the settlers did not forget Gudrid's dream. They did not immediately set out to find the green land, because there was work to be done, cattle to tend, fields to plant, fish to catch. But the dream had planted a seed that would take root and grow slowly over many years. And in time, that seed would lead to new voyages, new settlements, new stories. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us return to the settlement, to the work of the spring. The settlers were busy from dawn to dusk, and sometimes after dusk, by the light of the moon and the stars. They had to rebuild the houses, repair the roofs, mend the boats. They had to plant the barley and the flax in the small fields that they had cleared among the rocks. They had to tend the cattle, which were thin and weak after the long winter, and they had to watch for the first signs of illness or injury. And they had to continue hunting and fishing, because the stores were empty and the new supplies were not yet ready. It was during this time that the settlers discovered another secret, one that was both frustrating and funny. They discovered that the Greenlandic summer was not like the summers they had known in Iceland. The days were long, yes, but the nights were still cold. The sun would shine for hours, but the wind would blow from the ice cap and the temperature would drop. The grass would grow, but it would grow slowly, and it would be tough and sparse. The barley would sprout, but it would not always ripen. The flax would grow tall, but the fibers would be coarse and short, and the settlers would shake their heads and mutter under their breath, and they would wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. But they did not give up. They adapted. They learned to plant the barley in the warmest spots against the south-facing slopes. They learned to harvest the grass before it turned brown, to dry it quickly and store it in the barns. They learned to fish at night when the capelin rose to the surface, and to hunt the seals in the early morning when they basked on the ice. They learned to use every part of every animal to waste nothing, to plan ahead. And slowly, over the years, they developed a way of life that was suited to this strange and beautiful land. It was a life of small victories and small defeats, a life in which the quality of a piece of seal meat could make or break a day, a life in which the birth of a calf was a cause for celebration, and the death of a cow was a cause for mourning, a life in which the arrival of a ship from Norway was a moment of pure joy, not just for the goods it carried, but for the news, the stories, the faces of old friends and new faces. And it was a life in which the departure of a ship was a moment of sadness, because it meant that the isolation would return, that the connection to the wider world would be cut off until the next summer. And so the years passed, and the settlement grew. New houses were built, new farms established, new families arrived. Church was built, a small stone building with a turf roof, and a priest came to live in the settlement, to hold services, and to teach the children to read and write. The children learned their letters on scraps of parchment, using ink made from soot and water. They learned to write their names, to write the Lord's Prayer, to write the stories of the saints and the sagas of the kings. And they learned to write their own stories, the stories of their own lives, which they would pass on to their children and their children's children. But the hardest story to tell was the story of the winter that did not end. It began with a summer that was too cold and too wet. The hay did not grow, the barley did not ripen, the fish did not come, the seals were scarce, the cattle grew thin and sickly, and when the autumn came, the settlers looked at their stores and saw that they would not last. They would not last through the long winter. And so they did what they had to do. They slaughtered the remaining cattle, dried the meat, rationed the food. They hunted the seals and the birds, and they ate the liver, the heart, the tongue. They ate the fish heads and the fish bones. They boiled the seaweed and the lichens. They ate the moss, the roots, the bark. They ate everything that could be eaten, and they still went hungry. And the winter was long, and the darkness was deep, and the cold was bitter. The settlers huddled in their houses, wrapped in furs, burning the last of the turf and the driftwood. They told stories to keep their spirits up, but the stories grew thin and tired, like the people themselves. The children cried, and the adults wept in the darkness. And one by one, the old and the weak began to die. The first to go were the babies, who could not survive without milk. Then the old people, whose bodies had given up. Then the sick, who could not fight the infections that came with the cold and the hunger. And the settlers buried them in the frozen ground, marking the graves with stones, and they said the prayers that they had learned from the priest. But the priest himself fell ill. He lay in his bed, shivering and sweating, and he called the settlers to his side. He told them that they must not lose hope. He told them that God had not abandoned them. He told them that the spring would come, that the ice would break, that the sun would return. And then he closed his eyes and died. And the settlers buried him next to the church, and they said the prayers themselves, stumbling over the words, but saying them anyway. And the winter continued. The days grew longer, but the warmth did not return. The snow fell and fell, and the wind howled, and the sea was locked in ice. The settlers began to wonder if the spring would ever come. They began to wonder if they were the last people on earth, if everyone else had died, if the world had ended, and they were the only ones left. And some of them stopped hoping. Some of them lay down in the snow and did not get up. Some of them walked out onto the ice and did not come back, but not all. There were some who held on, some who remembered Gudrid's dream, some who believed that the Greenland was real, that it was waiting for them, that if they could just survive the winter, they would find it. And so they held on. They shared what little food they had. They sang songs. They told stories. They held each other in the darkness. And slowly, imperceptibly, the winter began to loosen its grip. One morning, a man named Thorvald walked out of his house and saw a patch of sky that was not gray but blue. A small patch, no bigger than a hand, but blue. And he called to his wife, and she came out and saw it too. And they stood together looking at the blue patch of sky, and they did not say anything. They just stood there, their arms around each other, feeling the hope begin to bloom in their chests. And the next day, the blue patch was larger. And the day after that, the sun rose a little higher. And the day after that, a bird appeared. A small bird, a snow bunting, perched on the roof of the church and sang a song. And the settlers heard it, and they came out of their houses, and they listened, and they wept, and they laughed, and they knew that they had made it through, that the winter was over, that the spring had come at last. And so the story of the Viking settlers in Greenland is not just a story of survival. It is a story of endurance. It is a story of hope, of the small, stubborn flame that burns in the human heart, even in the deepest darkness. And that flame is what carries us through our own winters, our own long nights. It is what allows us to see the blue patch of sky, to hear the bird's song, to believe that the ice will break. And it is what allows us, when the spring comes, to step out into the light and begin again. And so the spring came, and the ice began to break, and the settlers emerged from their houses like animals waking from a long hibernation. They blinked in the pale sunlight, their faces thin and lined, their bodies weak from hunger. But they were alive, and that was enough. They looked at the patches of green that began to appear on the slopes, and they felt a quiet joy, a joy that was not loud or triumphant, but deep and steady, like the sound of water dripping from a melting icicle. The first task was to rebuild the stores. The winter had emptied them completely, and the settlers knew that they could not afford another such season. They had to prepare, to plan, to store every scrap of food that the land could provide. And so they began to work, slowly at first, then with growing energy as the days grew longer and the sun grew warmer. They repaired the barns and the houses, which had suffered from the weight of the snow and the wind. They cleaned the byres and the sheds, and they prepared the fields for planting. But the fields were poor. The soil was thin and rocky, and the cold had killed many of the plants that had struggled to grow the previous summer. The settlers had to start again, to break the ground with their iron-tipped plows, to drag stones from the fields and build walls around them. They worked from dawn until dusk, their backs bent, their hands rough and calloused, and they did not complain because they knew that this was the price of survival. One of the settlers, a woman named Ingrid, had a way with the earth. She had been a farmer in Iceland, and she knew the secrets of the soil. She knew that the best way to improve the land was to add manure, to let the cattle graze on the fallow fields, to rotate the crops so that the ground did not become tired. She knew that the barley needed a sheltered spot, and that the turnips needed a deep, loamy soil. And she knew that the hay had to be cut at just the right time, before the sun dried it too much, and that it had to be turned and dried quickly, so that it would keep through the winter. Ingrid was a quiet woman with gray hair and a face that had been weathered by the wind and the salt. She did not speak much, but when she spoke, the others listened. She would walk through the fields, her hand touching the grass, her eyes scanning the sky. She could tell when a storm was coming, when the rain would fall, when the frost would kill the young shoots. And she would guide the settlers gently, patiently, like a mother guiding a child. She taught them to plant the barley in rows, to weed it carefully, to water it when the weather was dry. She taught them to build small stone walls around the fields, to trap the heat and keep the wind at bay. She taught them to plant kale and cabbage, which could survive the cold better than other vegetables. And she taught them to save the seeds, to dry them and store them in clay pots, so that they would have something to plant the next year. And the settlers learned. They watched Ingrid, and they followed her example. They began to see the land not as an enemy, but as a partner, a living thing that could be coaxed and cared for. They learned to read the signs, to understand the weather patterns, to know when to sow and when to harvest. And slowly, over the years, the fields began to produce. The barley grew taller and stronger. The hay grew thick and sweet. The cattle grew fat and healthy. And the settlers began to feel a sense of security, a sense that they could survive in this land. But the land was not the only challenge. There was also the sea. The sea was a source of food, but it was also a source of danger. The settlers had to learn to navigate the treacherous waters of the fjords, to avoid the hidden rocks and the shifting currents. They had to learn to read the tides, to know when the water would be high and when it would be low. And they had to learn to build boats that could withstand the rough seas, boats that were sturdy and reliable, like the ones they had used in Iceland. A man named Bjorn was the boat builder. He was a tall, lean man with a thick beard and hands that were scarred and calloused from years of working with wood. He could look at a tree and see a boat, could shape the planks with his axe and his adze, could fit them together so tightly that they would not leak. He built small boats for fishing and larger boats for trading and exploring. And he taught the younger men to build boats too, to pass on the skills that had been passed down to him. One summer, Bjorn decided to build a new boat. He had heard stories of a place to the north, a place where the sea was full of fish and the shores were covered with driftwood. He wanted to explore, to see if the stories were true. And so he gathered a crew of 6 men, and they set out in the new boat, heading north along the coast. The days were long and the nights were short, and the sun never fully set. They sailed past towering cliffs and green valleys, past waterfalls and glaciers. And they saw things that no one from the settlement had ever seen. A herd of walruses lounging on a beach, a pod of whales spouting in the distance, a flock of seabirds so large that it darkened the sky. But they also saw danger. They saw icebergs that loomed like mountains, their blue-white shapes shimmering in the twilight. They saw the mist that rose from the sea, thick and cold, hiding the rocks and the shallows. And they saw the storms that came without warning, the wind that howled, and the waves that crashed against the boat like fists. Bjorn and his crew had to be careful, had to watch the sky and the sea, had to make decisions quickly and wisely. They reached the place that the stories had spoken of, a wide fjord with a sandy shore. There was driftwood everywhere, logs and branches piled up by the waves, dried and bleached by the sun. And there were fish in the sea, so many that they could be caught by hand. The men were amazed. They spent several days there, gathering driftwood and fishing, and they loaded the boat with their treasures. Then they turned south, heading home. The journey back was long and hard. The wind was against them, and the sea was rough. One of the men, a young man named Olaf, fell overboard and was nearly lost. Bjorn threw him a rope, and the others pulled him back into the boat, shivering and coughing. They huddled together for warmth, eating raw fish and drinking seawater, because they had run out of fresh water. And when they finally arrived at the settlement, they were exhausted, sunburned, and thirsty. But they were alive, and they had brought back the driftwood and the fish. The settlers celebrated their return. They built a bonfire on the beach, and they roasted the fish and told stories about the journey. Bjorn gave a piece of driftwood to each family, a gift that would be used for furniture or tools or fuel. And the settlers looked at the driftwood and thought about the faraway places it had come from, the forests and rivers and shores that they would never see. They thought about the great trees that had grown in lands that were warmer and greener than their own. And they felt a quiet wonder, a sense of connection to a world that was larger and wilder than the one they lived in. But the settlers also had to deal with the other inhabitants of the land. There were the Skraelings, as they called them, the people who had lived in Greenland for thousands of years. They were the ancestors of the Inuit, and they knew the land and the sea in ways that the Vikings could never understand. They knew how to hunt the seals and the walruses, how to build kayaks and igloos, how to travel across the ice and snow. They knew the best places to fish and the best times to hunt, and they knew how to survive the long, dark winters. The first contact between the Vikings and the Skraelings was cautious, uncertain. One day, a group of Skraelings appeared at the edge of the settlement. They were dressed in furs, their faces painted with ochre and charcoal. They carried spears and harpoons, and they looked at the settlers with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The settlers, in turn, stared back at the Skraelings, not knowing what to do. No one moved. The dogs sniffed the air. A child cried. And then an old woman, the wise woman of the settlement, stepped forward. She held up her hands, palms open, and she spoke to the Skraelings in words that they could not understand. But they understood the gesture. They nodded and stepped forward, and they exchanged gifts: a piece of seal meat for a piece of iron, a walrus tusk for a piece of cloth. And so the trade began. The settlers learned that the Skraelings had goods that they needed: fat for lamps, skins for clothing, bones for tools. And the Skraelings wanted the settlers' metal, their knives and their axes, their pots and their needles. They exchanged goods, and they exchanged stories, though the stories were often misunderstood, translated through gestures and signs. And they learned to coexist, to respect each other's territories and ways of life. But there were also conflicts. The Skraelings did not always understand the settlers' ways, and the settlers did not always understand the Skraelings. There were misunderstandings and disagreements, and sometimes there were fights. A man was killed, or a cow was stolen, or a boat was damaged, and the settlers would retreat to their farms, building their walls higher, keeping their weapons close. But they also tried to make peace, to send emissaries with gifts, to negotiate agreements. It was not easy. It was complicated, like all human relationships. But it was necessary, because they all had to survive in the same land. And so the settlers learned to navigate the social world as well as the physical world. They learned to be patient and careful, to think before they acted, to consider the consequences of their words and their deeds. They learned that survival was not just about food and shelter, but about community and cooperation, about trust and respect. And they learned that the small, quiet moments of kindness were as important as the grand, heroic deeds. One of those small moments happened during a summer evening. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The settlers had finished their work for the day, and they were sitting outside their houses, talking and laughing. A group of children were playing a game, chasing each other around the stones and the grass. And an old woman, the same wise woman who had greeted the Skraelings, was sitting on a bench, braiding a rope from strips of seal skin. She was humming a tune, a song that her mother had taught her in Iceland, a song about a girl who waited for her lover to return from the sea. A young girl came and sat beside her. She was perhaps 7 years old, with the same gray eyes as her father. She watched the old woman's hands, the way they moved so quickly and so surely, pulling the strips of skin tight, weaving them together. "What are you making?" the girl asked. "A rope," said the old woman. "A rope for the boat." "Why are you making a rope?" the girl asked. "Because we need a rope to tie the boat to the shore," said the old woman. "And because it is good to have something to do with your hands while you are thinking." "What are you thinking about?" the girl asked. The old woman paused and looked up at the sky. The clouds were turning pink and orange, and the mountains were growing dark. "I am thinking about how far away we are," she said. I am thinking about the sea and the ice and the long, dark winters. I am thinking about the people we have lost and the people we have found. And I am thinking about what we will leave behind. Will we ever leave this place? The girl asked. The old woman shook her head. No, she said. We are too old to leave, and the children are too young. This is our home now. This is where we belong. But will our children leave? The girl asked. The old woman was silent for a moment. She thought about the stories that had been passed down to her, the stories of the Viking kings and the voyages to distant lands. She thought about the ambition and the restlessness that had driven her people across the sea, the desire for adventure and glory. And she thought about the quiet, steady life that she had found here, in this place that was harsh and beautiful, demanding and generous. Some of them will leave, she said. That is what our people do. They leave, they explore, they search for new lands and new opportunities. But some of them will stay. They will stay and build lives here. They will raise children and bury parents. They will plant trees and build houses. They will make this place their own. And the girl nodded, as if she understood. And the old woman continued to braid the rope, and the children continued to play. And the sun set behind the mountains, and the stars began to appear in the sky. And so the story of the Viking settlers in Greenland continued. It was a story of small moments, of quiet decisions, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of adaptation, of connection, of finding meaning in a difficult world. And it is a story that reminds us that we are all settlers, in a way, all making our way through unknown terrors and unfamiliar landscapes. And that the most important thing we can do is to hold on to each other, to share our stories, to keep the flame of hope alive. Even when the darkness is deep and the winter is long. And so the winter came again, and the settlers settled into the rhythm of the cold. They had learned much in their first years, but each winter brought its own lessons, its own quiet revelations. The snow fell thick and soft, covering the pastures and the stones, and the fjord froze over with a layer of ice that groaned and creaked under the weight of the dark. The settlers stayed close to their houses, huddling around the fire, telling the same stories again and again, until they knew them by heart. They spoke of the voyage from Iceland, of the green hills they had left behind, of the families that had stayed in the old country. And they spoke of the future, of the day when the sun would return and the grass would grow and the cows would give milk again. But the future was always uncertain, and the present demanded all their attention. One of the greatest challenges was keeping the livestock alive through the winter. The cows and sheep needed hay, and the settlers had stored as much as they could after the brief, intense summer. But the hay was never enough. They rationed it carefully, feeding the animals just enough to keep them alive, not enough to make them fat. The cows grew thin and bony, their ribs showing through their thick winter coats. They stood in the byre, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes patient and sad. The settlers would come in the morning and evening, carrying armfuls of hay, and the cows would low softly, their voices echoing in the stone walls. There was one old cow, a patient beast with a wide brown back and a gentle manner, that had become a favorite of the children. They would come and stroke her forehead, and she would nuzzle their hands with her warm nose, and they would whisper secrets to her. The children told her about their dreams, about the games they had played, about the stories they had heard. And the cow listened, chewing her cud, her eyes half closed, as if she understood every word. The settlers joked that the cow was the wisest of them all, because she did not complain about the cold or the darkness, but simply endured day after day, waiting for the spring. And the spring did come, as it always does, though it seemed impossible during the dark months. The sun rose higher in the sky, and the ice began to crack and melt. The sounds of water dripping and flowing became a constant music, and the settlers emerged from their houses, blinking at the light. The fields were muddy and wet, but the grass was already pushing through the soil, green and tender. The cows and sheep were let out of the byre, and they staggered into the sunlight, their legs unsteady from months of confinement. They grazed on the new grass with a desperate hunger, and the settlers watched them with relief and gratitude. And then the settlers would plant their crops again, barley and flax, in the thin, rocky soil. They knew by now that the soil was not as rich as the soil in Iceland, and the summer was shorter and cooler. They had learned to plant early, to use the brief warmth of the sun to protect the young shoots from the wind. They had learned to build raised beds and to add seaweed and fish bones to the earth, to give it whatever nourishment they could. And they had learned to accept that the harvest would never be plentiful, that they would always be hungry, that they would always have to rely on the sea and the hunt to fill their bellies. But they also learned to find joy in the small things, the things that could not be measured in bushels of grain or pounds of fish. There were the flowers that bloomed in the brief Arctic summer, tiny bright blossoms of purple and white that carpeted the hillsides. There were the birds that returned, flocks of geese and ducks and puffins, filling the air with their calls. There were the evenings when the sun lingered on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the settlers would sit on the rooftops of their houses, watching the light fade, feeling the warmth on their faces. And there were the long, light nights when the children could play outside until midnight, chasing each other through the fields, their laughter carrying across the fjord. One of those summer evenings, a group of settlers decided to journey to a small island a few miles off the coast. They had heard that there was a colony of seals there, and they wanted to hunt them for their skins and their fat. They took a boat, a sturdy little vessel that had been patched and repaired many times, and they rowed out into the calm, gray water. The sea was still and quiet, and the oars dipped into the water with a soft splash. The sun was low, but it would not set for hours, and the light was pale and pearly, casting no shadows. On the island, they found the seals, dozens of them, lying on the rocks and the sand. They were fat and lazy, basking in the sun. The settlers approached carefully, trying not to alarm them, but they were not skilled hunters. Their arrows missed, their spears fell short. The seals slid into the water with a splash and disappeared, and the settlers were left empty-handed. They sat on the beach, frustrated and tired, the seals gone and the sun still bright and mocking. One of the settlers, a young man named Einar, who had a reputation for being clumsy and unlucky, picked up a rock and threw it into the water. He did it with a kind of anger, a frustration that he could not hide. The rock hit the surface and splashed, and the sound echoed across the island. Then something strange happened. A seal, perhaps a young one, perhaps a curious one, poked its head out of the water and looked at Einar. It swam closer, closer still, until it was only a few feet away. It looked at Einar with its big, dark eyes, and Einar looked back at it, and neither of them moved. The other settlers watched, holding their breath. Einar slowly lowered his hand and reached into his pouch. He took out a piece of dried fish, the last of his rations, and he held it out to the seal. The seal sniffed the air, then swam forward and took the fish from his hand with a gentle, quick motion. It swallowed the fish, and then, without a sign of fear, it rolled onto its back and floated, its belly pale and round in the water. Einar laughed, a quiet, surprised laugh. The other settlers laughed with him, the tension broken. They did not try to kill the seal. They sat on the beach and watched it play in the water, rolling and diving, snatching at the kelp. And they felt a strange peace, a sense of being connected to the animals and the sea in a way that was not about hunting or eating, but about simply being there, sharing the same world. They returned to the settlement late that night, the sun still low and the sky still bright. They told the others about the seal, about the strange encounter, and the story was passed around the fire. And the settlers smiled, and they felt that this was a good omen, a sign that the land might accept them after all. They had not killed the seal, and the seal had not feared them. And in that moment, they felt less like strangers and more like neighbors, as if they were beginning to belong. And so the years passed, one after another, each winter a little easier, each summer a little more productive. The children grew up, and the old people grew older, and the settlement changed. New houses were built, new families arrived from Iceland, and the land was transformed in small, patient ways. The settlers built a stone church, a small, sturdy building with a wooden roof, and there they gathered on Sundays to sing hymns and listen to the priest, a weathered man with a voice like a foghorn and a beard that reached his waist. He preached about the kindness of God and the mercy of the sea, and he reminded them that they were not alone, that they were part of a story that stretched back to the beginning of time. And the settlers continued to trade with the Skraelings, learning their language, learning their customs. They became friends with some of them, and they married into their families. The children of the settlers played with the children of the Skraelings, and they learned to run on snow and ice, to build igloos and kayaks, to hunt seals and walruses. They became a people of two worlds, their blood mixed, their stories combined. And they built a life that was neither Viking nor Inuit, but something new, something that could survive in the cold, dark land. But the old ways were not forgotten. The settlers still told the stories of Odin and Thor, of the voyages of Eirik the Red, of the great feasts and the battles. They sang the old songs and recited the old poems, and they remembered the warmth of the sun in Iceland, the green hills and the rivers full of salmon. But they also loved the land they had chosen, the quiet beauty of the fjords and the mountains, the strange light of the midnight sun, the silence of the winter snow. They had made their home in this place, and they had learned to survive. But more than that, they had learned to live. And so the story goes on, a story of small, persistent acts of courage, of food shared and hope renewed, of voices heard across the fire. And if you listen carefully, on a quiet night when the wind is low and the stars are bright, you can still hear them, the settlers, the Skraelings, the children, the animals, the sea itself. They are telling their stories, and they are waiting for you to listen. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle.